Bonjour à tous, nous sommes dans une nouvelle vidéo consacrée cette fois-ci à la bioéthique et dans cette interview, j'ai le plaisir de recevoir avec moi la docteure Stacy Trasancos qui est américaine, qui ne parle pas français, mais je vais essayer de traduire du mieux que je peux cette interview en langue française pour que vous puissiez comprendre ce qu'elle dit. Donc je vais lui demander d'abord de se présenter. So, hi Stacy, would you present yourself to our audience, please? Who are you and how did you come to write this book?
Okay, my name is Stacy Trasancos. My background is chemistry, and then I also got degrees in philosophy and theology. I'm a mother of seven and a grandmother of seven more children. And I came to write this book because in the United States, President Donald Trump promised before he was even elected that he would make in vitro fertilization, IVF, available widely and cost less. And the Catholic Church has always said this is immoral. And so I wrote the book in 1 month, only 1 month, to get it published in time to drive the conversation in the United States about IVF.
Great, thank you. Donc, ce qu'elle vient de dire ici, c'est qu'elle a écrit ce livre en réaction aux positions de Donald Trump sur la question de la fécondation in vitro. Donc, tout son livre est consacré à la question de la fécondation in vitro et elle a voulu le publier en un mois seulement pour pouvoir relancer le débat aux États-Unis sur cette question bioéthique de grande importance. So, the next question I want to ask you is a simple definition. So, how do you define IVF? Please give us a brief history of IVF and the terminology in question. Donc en français, donc donnez-nous une définition de ce qu'est la fécondation in vitro, une brève histoire de la fécondation in vitro et les définitions de la terminologie qui est en question sur ce sujet.
IVF, it comes from a technique with livestock where the gametes, the sperm and the egg, are introduced in a petri dish, and then the embryo is inserted into the female womb. In humans, IVF is done by first stimulating egg production in the woman and removing the eggs surgically. And then in the man, the sperm is collected independently. And then the two are put together in a petri dish. And then when an embryo forms from that, when they're what we call conception, then the embryo or embryos are inserted into the woman. And then the hope is that a pregnancy will occur.
Donc, la définition de la fécondation in vitro, c'est le fait de prendre des spermatozoïdes chez l'homme et des ovules chez la femme, et puis les faire rencontrer en dehors du corps maternel, artificiellement, et puis pour créer un embryon en dehors du corps de la mère. Et une fois que cet embryon ou cette pluralité d'embryons est créée, alors on implante cet embryon ou ces embryons dans l'utérus maternel pour essayer de commencer une grossesse. So that's the definition. Could you give us a brief history of IVF? Donc, une petite histoire de la fécondation in vitro maintenant.
Yes, there's a history with the church and a history with science that go parallel. In the history with the church, even back in the 1800s, the late 1800s, the process of what we do with livestock was discussed for humans. And even then, when it was only in discussion, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo the 13th, I believe, said no. He said this procedure is not okay for humans. Fast forward to 1978, when the first test tube baby was born in England, the church still said no and even published Donum Vitae and later on Dignitas Personae, two instructions from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith telling us why in vitro fertilization is illicit.
Donc, ce qui s'est passé, c'est que du point de vue de l'histoire de la fécondation in vitro, ça a commencé un petit peu au 19e siècle où les premières tentatives ont été faites. Le pape Léon XIII s'y est opposé dès le début, mais la première fois qu'un être humain est vraiment né de fécondation in vitro, c'était en 1978. Et donc, la première fille a été créée par fécondation in vitro. En réaction à ça, l'Église catholique a promulgué l'instruction Donum Vitae avec le cardinal Ratzinger à l'époque, puis Dignitas Personae, qui est un autre document du magistère sur la question, qui condamne la fécondation in vitro. Donc ça, c'est dans les années 70-80.
Yes, thank you for translating.
Yeah, no
Uh,
problem. And so
very
now for
impressive.
the terminology, is there a special terminology we need to know for IVF? Donc, est-ce qu'il y a une terminologie spécifique que l'on doit connaître pour la fécondation in vitro?
The church uses the word artificial procreation in her documents. IVF is in vitro fertilization. The medical term is also assisted reproductive technology. And then there's variations of that have other words depending on how the sperm and the egg are introduced to each other and then implanted in the woman. But the church's word, artificial reproduction, it's kind of a misnomer because the way the church artificial procreation, I'm sorry, the way the church talks about it, procreation cannot be artificial. Procreation should be conception in love, which is only properly done within the intimacy of marital intercourse. But the word artificial procreation is used to highlight why it shouldn't be artificial.
Donc, on parle de procréation artificielle pour montrer pourquoi la procréation ne devrait pas être artificielle. Donc, l'Église catholique utilise le terme de fécondation artificielle dans des instructions comme Donum Vitae. And so, could you distinguish what the church calls um, heterologous IVF or homologous? In Donum Vitae, it talks about in French, fécondation artificielle hétérologue and fécondation artificielle homologue. So could you please explain the difference between the two?
Yeah. Heterologous is when it doesn't come from husband and wife. So maybe the woman uses an egg donor or purchases an egg from another woman, or maybe the man does the same thing. Or even in the case of um, even in the case of homosexuality, they would buy the egg and the sperm from other people. So homologous is within marriage, and heterologous is anything else.
Donc la différence entre la fécondation artificielle homologue et hétérologue, c'est que quand c'est homologue, c'est au sein du mariage, au sein du couple. Donc le mari et la femme prennent leurs spermatozoïdes et ovules pour créer l'embryon en dehors du ventre maternel, mais ça vient du couple. Et hétérologue, c'est quand ça provient d'un autre couple en dehors du mariage. Et donc là, on fait appel à un donneur de sperme ou un don d'ovocytes. Et donc les deux sont condamnés par l'Église, mais les deux sont distingués. So thank you for this terminology. Could you please now present the central reason the church opposes IVF and the arguments you give in the book? And you can do it in many steps so that I can translate
Okay.
step by step. Yeah.
Yeah. The main reason the church has always said no is because of what I call the principle of inseparability. The principle states that you cannot separate the unitive and the procreative aspects of the conjugal act. And those are very theological words, but they mean that you can't separate the life giving from the love making within marriage.
Donc la raison centrale pour laquelle l'Église s'oppose à la fécondation in vitro, c'est en raison du fait que cette fécondation in vitro sépare les deux finalités de la sexualité, l'union et la procréation, qui du coup n'existent plus dans un seul et même acte, mais qui sont séparés. Et donc c'est la raison principale pour laquelle l'Église s'y oppose, c'est-à-dire que tout enfant a le droit naturel de naître de l'union charnelle de ses propres parents. Is there another reason why the church opposes it?
So that's the main reason. All the other reasons flow from there, derive from there. The main reason is foreign to modern culture. It doesn't sound like a reason at all, which is why we need to be talking about this. But what happens when you separate the unitive and the procreative aspects of marriage, then it's kind of the same thing as with contraception. Contraception removes the life-giving part. IVF removes the love-making part. And from there flow other problems. With IVF, the other problems are that you have the heterologous part introduced. Now you can buy eggs and sperm. It turns procreation into a commodity, children into commodities. It makes it so people can buy babies. It leads to ideas like if you can create a baby when you want, then you can kill them when you want. So there's selective reduction and freezing embryos in the freezers. And from there come all kinds of other problems.
Donc, il y a aussi plein d'autres problèmes liés à la fécondation in vitro. Le fait que, on puisse créer des bébés en dehors du ventre maternel, qu'on puisse créer, voilà, à la demande des enfants, et qu'on puisse acheter des enfants parce que tout ça, c'est payant, évidemment. On doit payer pour avoir des enfants. Donc, c'est presque une commodité. J'ai envie d'un enfant, hop, j'en ai un. Et surtout, ça crée des embryons surnuméraires, des embryons qui sont congelés, et qui sont maintenus dans des congélateurs, toute leur vie, qui ne verront jamais le jour. Donc ça crée d'autres problèmes, l'entreprise de la fécondation in vitro. Is that your in the book, do you defend this central aspect of the church's position, or do you try to go further? How do you argue this in the book? Comment est-ce que vous argumentez ça plus en profondeur dans le livre?
Most people in this debate realize that saying the principle of inseparability is meaningless to a lot of people in our culture. And so some people go one way and they talk about selective abortion. They talk about freezing embryos in the freezer and killing them or using them for science. And they talk about all the things that go wrong with the embryos. And they avoid the deeper ontological argument. And I chose to go into that since I was writing a whole book and I had a chance to get into why the church says you can't separate the unitive and the procreative aspects of the conjugal act.
Donc, ce qu'elle dit, c'est que la plupart du temps, les gens, quand ils parlent contre la fécondation in vitro, ils pointent sur le fait que ça génère des embryons surnuméraires. On a aujourd'hui des millions, voire même, je crois, au total, 1 milliard d'embryons congelés dans le monde, ce qui est énorme, de ces êtres humains qui ne verront jamais le jour. Donc, c'est analogue un peu avec ce qui se passe pour l'avortement. On crée des êtres humains pour finir par les tuer en les décongelant. Donc, ça pose plein de problèmes. Mais ce qu'a voulu faire la docteure Trasancos dans ce livre, c'est se focaliser sur la raison de la séparabilité. On ne sépare pas l'union et la procréation. Et le problème de la fécondation in vitro, c'est que justement, elle sépare les deux finalités de la sexualité, l'union et la procréation. Okay. So, would you say that the church, when the church condemns IVF, in terms of authority, is that teaching considered infallible, or what kind of a sense must Catholic give to this teaching? Donc, autrement dit, est-ce que l'enseignement de l'Église catholique sur la fécondation in vitro est considéré comme infaillible, ou alors quel degré d'assentiment les catholiques doivent donner à cet enseignement de l'Église catholique?
Yeah, it's what we call there's several different terms for it, but I'll just use lay terms. Um, there is an infallible teaching at the root of it, which is why I decided to go that way. The infallible teaching is that the human is body and rational soul composite, made in the image and likeness of God, and that marriage is to become one, man and woman united in the most intimate relationship, which is an echo of the Holy Trinity. So those are the infallible teachings. And from that, you can derive all these other church teachings that have to do with abortion, contraception, marriage, homosexuality, and IVF falls in there. So it is a derived teaching from the fundamental de fide dogmas of the Catholic Church.
Donc, bien que cet enseignement ne soit pas strictement infaillible au sens strict, c'est un enseignement qui est dérivé de principes déjà infaillibles. Et donc, ces principes infaillibles sont le fait que le mariage est fait pour unir l'homme et la femme dans un seul et même acte conjugal et que les finalités de la sexualité sont l'union et la procréation qui coexistent en un seul et même acte. Et donc, de manière dérivée, on peut en conclure que des actes comme la contraception, l'avortement, la fécondation in vitro, d'autres actes comme ça qui s'opposent à au moins une des deux finalités de la sexualité sont aussi immoraux en se fondant sur ces principes déjà infailliblement enseignés par l'Église catholique. So thank you for that clear answer. Would you say that the belief in the immorality of IVF can be known independently from the Christian faith? So can we show IVF is immoral without believing in the Bible, without believing in Christian revelation? If not, how could you impose it on others and try to make it illegal for everyone in society, even for people who do not have faith?
That's a huge question. And there are many ways to answer it. So I'll just choose one way, but there's so much more I can say about this. Um, it's Aquinas talks about what are self-evident truths. And so if you assume that someone will know and recognize the self-evident truth that marriage is sacred, then you don't need to go back to all the deeper ontological arguments or the de fide dogmas of the Catholic Church. But that presumes someone will understand the sacredness of marriage. And I think a lot of people do. They just don't have the words for it, but they know that when two people get married, it's meant to be some special indication of a new relationship. Do you want me to stop there?
Donc, je demandais à la docteure Trasancos si on pouvait savoir que la fécondation in vitro était immorale, indépendamment de la Bible, de la révélation chrétienne. Et en fait, ce qu'elle répond, c'est que en fait, on a tous un sens inné de ce qu'est le mariage, que le mariage sacré, et que c'est cette idée de l'union et la procréation qui coexistent dans l'acte marital, c'est quelque chose dont on n'a pas forcément besoin de la Bible pour le connaître. Et donc, c'est quelque chose que la raison naturelle est capable d'atteindre. So what you're saying is that you don't need a special biblical revelation to know from natural reason that the
Mhm.
end of sex in marriage is union and procreation in one act, reunited in one act. And so you don't
Mhm.
need to believe the Bible to know this. We can know this through natural
Right.
reason, right?
Yes, and you can also deny it. So that's the thing about self-evident truths. Like the existence of God is a self-evident truth, but people can know it with natural reason, but they can also deny it. They can also say, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the sanctity of marriage. So that's where the issue comes in.
Actually, I would on God's existence. Aquinas in the Summa Theologia says that although you can demonstrate God's existence, it is not self-evidence. He in the I think it's Article 2.
Very first
Uh,
part, yeah.
yeah, he says it's not self-evidence, but you can demonstrate it through reason. Do you agree with that?
Well, my interpretation of Aquinas there is that self-evident itself has two meanings. Self-evident, something can be self-evident in two senses. It can be self-evident in that anybody can know it, but not everybody will, or self-evident in that it can't be denied at all. And he gives different examples. You know, I would use things in science that with data are self-evident, can't be denied, but then using reason. That's where the frustration for me anyway comes in with these arguments because you expect people to know through reason certain things, but they just don't, or they don't admit it, and that's where I think a lot of the debates get hung up
So you're
in
saying
our
that
society.
in theory we can know it through reason, but in practice you need like
Yeah,
kind of the grace and revelation
yeah.
to guide you reason that is because of original sin, not always able to reason adequately. Is that your position?
That's a good way to say it. Yes.
Donc, ce que dit la docteure Trasancos, c'est que, en théorie, on peut connaître l'immoralité de la fécondation in vitro par la raison naturelle seule, mais étant donné les conséquences du péché originel sur la raison humaine et son incapacité parfois à voir des choses qui sont évidentes, comme le fait que le mariage est sacré et comme le fait que tout enfant a le droit naturel de naître de l'union maritale directement, et ben, ces vérités pourtant qui semblent évidentes à la raison naturelle sont parfois niées aujourd'hui. Et donc, il y a besoin de la révélation et de l'Église pour guider la conscience humaine dans l'adhésion à ces vérités. And so, how do you justify the fact that we should make IVF illegal, since you're saying that some people can deny it, and how can you impose on society legally something that it's tough to know through reason alone?
And that's a very good question. So it's the same thing with abortion or contraception or anything else in this area. Aquinas talks somewhere, and I don't know where exactly, but it's at the other end of the Summa. He talks about basically living in a pluralistic society, how you can't legislate every single moral and immoral act. You can't by rule of law make everyone behave morally. And so we have to figure out what we're going to do in society. And so what we're doing in the United States right now, and what I hope to do with my book, the reason I focused on the ontological arguments based on revelation and philosophy, is to equip Catholics in our society with a deeper understanding about the church's teaching so that we can change hearts. So if you convince people to choose virtue and to choose to act morally because they understand why, that is a better way to do it than to legislate it, which I don't think you can legislate. I don't think it would work. That's why I chose to go in that direction. And in the United States right now, we're not talking about legislating it, moral, legal or illegal. We're talking about greater funding for it. So we want to push back on that part.
Donc, ce que dit Stacy Trasancos, c'est que là, le but de son livre, c'est de convaincre les Américains de l'immoralité de la fécondation in vitro, même si aujourd'hui, elle est consciente qu'en pratique, c'est difficile de rendre ça illégal parce que c'est tellement inscrit dans les mœurs aux États-Unis. Here, I would say that, the Catholic Church teaches that not only things like abortion, things like that, are immoral, but it should be illegal. That's what Evangelium Vitae 73 says. And so,
Mhm.
I think that we can, even if the most of the population is not yet convinced that abortion is immoral as it kills an innocent human person, we could still make it illegal, just like it would have been good to make slavery illegal in the 19th
Mhm.
century in the US, even though most of the population wasn't yet convinced that it was immoral. So I think you can still legislate and impose, the state should make things illegal when they're gravely contrary to the common good, even if
Mhm.
society doesn't recognize it to be the case. Do you agree with that approach?
Yeah, I agree with that. The problem is, I mean, ideally, yes, absolutely. Ideally, God's laws and human laws would be the same thing. But you don't have all humans agreeing with God's laws. So ideally, we could make all the laws that are as perfect as we can get, and even then they won't be perfect because we're human too. We can make all the laws as close to God's laws as we can, but we're talking about a society of people that themselves choose who makes the laws. They elect, at least in the United States, we elect the lawmakers. And so I don't see how you're going to force other people to elect lawmakers that go against their own beliefs. So, in a pluralistic society where people elect the lawmakers, we can vote the way that we want to vote, but you can't be sure that everybody else will do the same thing. So, we always want to be voting and advocating, but also trying to change hearts and minds.
Voilà, donc le but de Stacy Trasancos, c'est avant tout de convaincre les Américains, comme je l'ai dit, de changer les cœurs. Et quand les cœurs seront changés, et les esprits convaincus, alors petit à petit, on pourra renverser cette loi infâme qui légalise la fécondation in vitro. Donc, c'est plutôt son approche de partir dans ce sens-là. Okay, so next question would be what are the arguments for and against embryo adoption? Where do you stand on this? I believe this is debated among Catholic theologians. Donc en gros,
Very
est-ce
much.
qu'il y a un débat chez les théologiens catholiques pour savoir est-ce qu'on peut adopter des embryons issus de FIV qui sont congelés ou alors est-ce qu'il faut les laisser mourir? Voilà, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire des embryons congelés?
Donum vitae and dignitas personae comment on embryo adoption, but like you said, theologians still disagree on the absolute answer. And the church has never said definitively yes or no. But like Aquinas talks about with moral guidance, there is the objective truth of whether something is immoral or moral. So IVF is objectively immoral. But then there's also the intent of the person that can affect the moral good of certain things. Something that's objectively immoral, the intent can never make it right. But something that's not objectively immoral, that can be moral, the intent matters. And so embryo adoption falls in that category. Embryo adoption is not in and of itself wrong, but the intent matters. If a couple or a person is using embryo adoption to get the baby they want, and they're using it the same way as IVF, that would not be right. If, however, there are women, there's a lot of Catholic women who, with their husbands, have discerned that they would like to give of their own body to give life to this embryo, not because they want a baby, but because they're willing to do that to save the life of the embryo. In those cases, it is a moral act.
Yeah. OK, thank you. Donc, ce que dit la docteure Trasancos, c'est que pour l'embryon, l'adoption des embryons, ce qui compte, c'est l'intention. L'intention, si l'intention, c'est juste de prendre un enfant parce que j'ai envie d'avoir un enfant, alors non, les enfants, normalement, sont le fruit directement de l'acte conjugal, l'acte charnel, et ne doivent pas être achetés comme ça par l'entreprise de fécondation in vitro. Si au contraire, l'intention, c'est de se dire, eh bien, il y a un enfant qui peut mourir, qui est dans un congélateur, et si je fais rien, il va finir par mourir, et donc par charité, je veux l'adopter pour lui sauver la vie. Là, l'intention est bonne, et donc ça peut être moralement acceptable. En tout cas, l'Église catholique s'est pas prononcée définitivement sur le fait que l'adoption d'embryons cryoconservés serait intrinsèquement immorale. C'est une question librement débattue chez les théologiens à l'heure actuelle. So thank you for this. The next question is, do you think that artificial uteruses can sometimes be used for, so for example, if the child is not viable, instead of having him die early in pregnancy, we could translate this embryo to an artificial womb and make it grow through artificial pregnancy until he is viable. Do you think that would be a moral option that Catholics can defend?
At this point in time, no, because the first of all, well, medically, we don't have the artificial womb, but they are trying to develop one. Um, and I don't. It's not a hard no. So I think Matthew that the question is going to be revisited if we ever medically are able to do the artificial womb. I will just quote Dignitas Personae 19. It says, there seems to be no morally licit solution. But in the same sentence, the instruction says, these embryonic children should be protected by law as human persons. And so there's a conflict even in Dignitas Personae about what we do with these embryos. I'll say more, but I'll let you translate that part.
Donc, je te peux poser la question, est-ce qu'on peut utiliser un utérus artificiel pour les enfants non viables pendant les grossesses, au lieu de les faire mourir sur la table d'hôpital? Peut-être qu'on peut essayer de les sauver, leur sauver la vie à travers un utérus artificiel. Et la docteure Trasancos répond que pour l'instant, ça n'existe pas, les utérus artificiels, et donc que l'Église n'a pas encore de prononcement définitif sur la question et qu'on on verra quand les utérus artificiels vont arriver Pour l'instant, l'instruction Dignitas Personae dit qu'il n'y a pas forcément de manière licite de s'en sortir pour l'instant aujourd'hui, mais cette question pourrait être revisitée dans un second temps, dans quelques années, quand ils créeront des utérus artificiels. Okay. Do you want to continue or do I go to the next question?
Do you want me to say more about that, or
Yeah, sure, you can
um,
say more about
there are some interesting solutions. Um, Practically speaking, there are not enough women willing to adopt embryos to solve the problem. Um, so some people have suggested that we baptize them all and let them die. Take them out of the freezers, baptize them, and let them die, because that would at least be honoring their dignity as human persons. However, practically speaking, that won't fix the problem, because the very next day there will be more embryos because people are still using IVF. So the only way to solve the problem is to maybe adopt as many as you can, baptize and let the others die, and then never ever use IVF again. But we're not at that point.
Donc là, quand on se pose la question, mais comment résoudre le problème de la fécondation in vitro d'un point de vue catholique, euh, ce qu'on peut proposer au meilleur des cas, même si c'est peu réaliste aujourd'hui, ça serait d'adopter un maximum d'embryons pour leur sauver la vie et les mettre dans des utérus maternels pour essayer de leur sauver la vie. Et ceux dont on ne peut pas sauver la vie, les enlever du congélateur et les baptiser au nom du Père, du Fils et du Saint-Esprit pour voilà, leur donner la grâce baptismale et leur assurer le salut. Et après, ne plus jamais refaire d'embryons cryoconservés. Donc, ça serait la manière idéale de résoudre le problème, même si aujourd'hui, en pratique, c'est très difficile. Thank you for these answers. Next question I had in mind was from what you're saying, you agree that ideally we should baptize all of these frozen embryos to ensure their salvation if possible. Have there ever been attempts to do that, like to go to hospitals where they do have these frozen embryos in labs and ask doctors if we can get access to these frozen embryos? Has there been attempts to do that or not by the Catholic Church?
Not that I know of, and I think that's where we're headed. I think if Catholics are going to get serious about this issue, then doing something like that at least honors the human dignity of these embryos in a way that people can't ignore. And it would cause an uproar. It would cause, imagine the couples who have their embryos in the freezers and they don't want them to die because they want to save them for later. And you're baptizing them. I mean, it would cause an uproar, but I think the church could make a legitimate argument that they have the to do that, given the way the parents have treated these embryos. It would be very controversial, though.
Hmm. Yeah, because the
But
church authorizes to baptize babies in cases of danger of
yes,
death, even if the parents don't agree, or do the parents have at least to give tacit consent or not give an objection? If the parent disagrees and the child is in danger of death, can you still baptize?
that is one of the things that I think is left to prudential judgment of the person in the moment. I don't see why not, because we are talking about salvation. However, even if there is a controversy and there's a fight or some reason you can't actually baptize the baby properly in that moment, there is baptism by desire. So I do think it is effective, if we, as the people of faith, pray for these embryos, and the aborted children, pray for them daily and say to God that we do desire their baptism and we want to stand in that gap. We're just not sure what God wants us to do. And then I think the answers will come, and they might be hard answers that, require us to speak up more in our societies.
Idéalement, ce qu'il faudrait, c'est baptiser ces bébés et aller dans les hôpitaux pour demander à ce que les médecins nous donnent ces embryons cryoconservés qui vont de toute façon mourir, qu'ils soient baptisés par l'Église catholique pour leur assurer le salut. parce qu'on sait que voilà, les bébés morts sans baptême, on peut prier, on peut espérer pour leur salut. Il y a ce qu'on appelle le baptême de désir. On peut espérer et prier collectivement pour leur salut, mais voilà, pour avoir la garantie du salut de ces bébés, il faut c'est mieux s'ils peuvent recevoir le baptême d'eau. Et donc, idéalement, l'Église catholique, dans le futur, en tout cas, nous dit Stacy, eh ben, on pourra peut-être obtenir auprès de certains laboratoires l'accès à ces embryons cryoconservés pour les baptiser. So in practice, it would be difficult because they're very, very small. How can you ensure that there's water that goes on each embryo, especially they're closely linked together? So how do you do that? Yeah, and you have to give them names. So um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It would be there's in the United States alone there's between 1 and 4 million embryos, and the reason it's 1 to 4 is because they keep better records of the genealogies of livestock than they do of human children, and so no one even knows for sure how many human embryos are stored in the liquid nitrogen tanks in the United States. Between 1 and 4 million, though, so that is a lot. It would be difficult to do. But if the intent is there and we're willing to not take shortcuts and to do all that we can, discerning the moment in our history here, I think God honors that. God, we're not in charge of what God does. God is in charge of what He does, and our job is to do everything that we can and
Voilà, donc,
discern. And it's a difficult question.
Voilà, donc c'est compliqué parce qu'aujourd'hui, aux États-Unis, on a entre 1 et 4 millions d'enfants cryoconservés et c'est compliqué d'avoir des statistiques là-dessus. Et ce serait compliqué en pratique de les baptiser chacun individuellement parce que les embryons sont de petite taille. Et ce que je disais, c'est qu'il faudrait leur donner des noms. Donc c'est compliqué, mais voilà, on peut prier voilà, pour que Dieu nous aide à réaliser ce genre de choses peut-être dans le futur. En tout cas, c'est loin d'être une situation idéale, mais voilà, on fait avec ce qu'on a selon la situation actuelle. So next question would be, people can argue that if someone is attempting to kill my child or to kill a child in the street, I can act in self-defense on the part of that child and kill the person who's trying to kill the child. So if we apply this logic to embryo who are frozen and someone is going to like unfreeze them and let them die, that would be sort of a kind of killing. So can we kill doctors in self-defense on the part of these embryos? What is your stance on this?
Yeah, it's the same question with abortion. Even more so, why can't we walk in? Why shouldn't we? It seems like we might have an obligation to go into an abortion clinic and kill the abortion doctors before they kill the next child. It's happening right now. Why aren't we there doing something about it? But it gets back to that pluralistic society, and I struggle with this question. I have no plans to go kill anybody, but it it's living in a pluralistic society. There are laws that we have to abide by to keep the peace, to keep moving society towards salvation. And it all falls under discernment. Every day as Catholics, we're supposed to be discerning how do we lead other people to heaven. But it causes panic sometimes when you think about how many children are dying by abortion, how many children are stored in freezers. It makes me angry that I have to even deal with this in society because of the sins of other people. I don't like it. I don't like that this is what we're leaving for my children and for my grandchildren. And so what I end up doing is writing books and talking and trying to change hearts and minds because I don't think I have any other choice.
Hmm. Ce que dit la docteure Trasancos, c'est qu'on vit aujourd'hui dans une société pluraliste avec des différents points de vue et des lois aujourd'hui qui autorisent ça. Et donc, même si c'est compliqué, on aurait envie d'agir en légitime défense de la part de ces enfants, quitte à empêcher les médecins coûte que coûte de réaliser ces actes comme l'avortement. Mais en pratique, ça serait compliqué si on se mettait tous à aller devant des cliniques d'avortement ou de fécondation in vitro et qu'on tuait les médecins qui s'apprêtaient à faire un avortement ou des choses comme ça, ça pourrait générer pas mal de chaos dans la société et ça pourrait être contre-productif pour notre mouvement. Donc, prudentiellement, peut-être que c'est pas la chose qu'il faut faire aujourd'hui, malheureusement, et donc on n'est pas dans une situation idéale, loin de là. Um, Another question I have is, do you think that, suppose like I'm a parent who in the past did IVF, I have my embryos frozen, and I converted to the Catholic faith, and I regret the act I did in the past. Do I have the moral obligation now to go back to the lab and say, actually, I want my children back and I have to
Yeah.
implant them in my wife's uterus to make them survive? Is that a moral obligation or not?
Yes, absolutely. It's a moral obligation. If and that and even if you don't have embryos in the freezer and you've used IVF, you have a moral obligation to admit that it was wrong, to seek to go to confession, ask for forgiveness, admit that it's wrong, tell other people that it's wrong and what it did in your life. I interviewed people like that for the book. And then set things right. So we all sin, but to back up and get out of sin, we go to confession, we amend our life, and then we try to avoid that sin going forward. And that's what anybody who's used IVF or contraception or abortion or sex outside of marriage, any of those things, that's what you do. Admit that it's wrong, ask for forgiveness, and then amend your life.
Mm. In the case of abortion, you cannot go back because the child has already been killed, but in the case of
Yes,
IVF, you can, so you should have the moral
exactly.
obligation to save your children. Donc, ce que dit Stacy, c'est que en fait, on a l'obligation morale si on est parent et que dans le passé, on a fait une fécondation in vitro, que du coup, il y a des embryons surnuméraires qui sont cryoconservés dans un réfrigérateur et que maintenant, on a pris conscience que c'était immoral, il y a l'obligation morale d'aller faire la demande de reprendre ces embryons et de les faire implanter dans l'utérus maternel de son épouse, voilà, si on est marié, pour, ça y est, faire survivre ses propres enfants. Donc, il y a ce devoir moral de réparer, d'aller se confesser, d'aller demander pardon à un prêtre, à Dieu de la part d'un prêtre. Et donc, confession et puis réparation dans la mesure du possible, ce qui implique de reprendre ces embryons. And that would imply a kind of embryo, or actually, that would imply that you implant this embryo in the uterus, so it won't be implanted in a natural way. So does the Catholic Church still agree with this because the life of the child is to be saved, even though it's not ideal to implant the existing embryo in the
Yeah.
maternal womb?
Yeah, that's left to interpretation. But my interpretation of dignitas personae is that if they're your own children, and you can do something to try to save them, you should,
Ouais. Donc
um,
en gros, ce que je disais,
by
c'est que c'est
whatever
pas
way is left open to you.
Ouais. Ce que je disais, c'est que c'était pas idéal, évidemment, de faire implanter un embryon dans l'utérus maternel artificiellement, mais là, on parle d'une situation où l'embryon existe déjà et qu'il faut lui sauver la vie, et que cette mère est responsable de l'existence de cet embryon qu'elle a créé par fécondation in vitro, et donc là, elle a le devoir moral de quand même l'implanter en elle pour le faire grandir dans son ventre, pour lui sauver la vie. C'est sa mère après tout. Et même si ça implique voilà, un moyen pas idéal, à savoir l'implanter artificiellement dans l'utérus, c'est quelque chose qui vaut le coup. If for example, parents have created, I don't know, like dozens of embryos outside the womb, and they cannot adopt all of them, can they donate these embryos to science or not? Baptize them? And no, that would be immoral, right?
Yeah, I would say no. What I think medically, and I'm not a medical doctor, but I would, if it were me in that situation, I would ask my doctor, I have too many embryos to implant at once, but can we have a plan to implant some at this time and wait and plant some more? Like I think you could come up with a better plan than just donating them to science would be to kill them. So don't kill them. Um, the only way you could argue is not killing them is to thaw them out and let them die naturally. It's still not letting them die naturally, but donating them to science, they actively kill them. So I would say absolutely no to science.
Donc, on ne peut absolument pas donner des embryons à la science pour qu'ils fassent des études dessus. C'est un acte intrinsèquement mauvais. Si on a créé des embryons par FIV qui sont au frigo, il faut en adopter voilà, le plus possible, en tout cas réparer ce qui a été fait, mais en tout cas, on ne peut pas donner ces embryons à la science parce que ça revient à les tuer. Other question, what would you say to someone who has been born from IVF and who says, well, if IVF were illegal, I wouldn't exist. So, Stacy, are you saying that I shouldn't be in existence? IVF is the reason why I exist today. That's an emotional
Yeah.
objection.
Yeah, I've met people like that, and the people I've met who are like that, I think they have a pretty good understanding that that's not what we're saying. But even if someone does say that, um, the answer is the reason the church objects to IVF, the reason about the principle of inseparability, don't separate the unitive and the procreative aspect of the conjugal act. It's because of the rights of the child. It's not because the child is any less. It's all of that is because the church is saying that child is worthy of dignity, of human dignity. And that child has a right to be born in the marital intimacy of a loving mother and father. So, what we're saying to that person is not that you shouldn't exist, it's that you had rights and your rights were violated.
When I say in these circumstances, I say, well, it's like people who are born in cases of rape, and I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, well, obviously rape is immoral, and if your mom hadn't been raped by your dad, you wouldn't exist, and but you would still agree that rape is immoral and that the way you were conceived doesn't influence your dignity right now today. So I think that's people can see that the objection is not very solid. Donc pour résumer ce qu'on
Mhm.
vient de dire. Je demandais comment réagir quand une personne nous dit, mais moi j'ai été conçu par fécondation in vitro. Si la fécondation in vitro n'existait pas, je n'existerais pas. Et donc, dire il faut rendre la fécondation in vitro illégale, c'est une offense à moi parce que je suis né de ça. On répond ici en disant que l'Église catholique s'oppose à la fécondation in vitro pour justement pour les droits de l'enfant. C'est que les droits de l'enfant ont été violés. Tout enfant a le droit naturel de naître de l'union conjugale directe de ses parents et de ne pas être créé derrière une vitre de manière artificielle par la science. Et donc, c'est ce moyen de création de l'enfant qui était mauvais, indépendamment comment dire, de la bonne intention des gens. Et cette personne qui existe maintenant, même si elle a été créée par un moyen qui est mauvais, cette personne, maintenant, elle a une dignité intrinsèque et une valeur intrinsèque énorme. Donc là, je donnais l'exemple que les personnes qui sont nées d'un viol, il pourrait dire, oui, mais si le viol entre mes parents, si mon père n'avait pas violé ma mère, je n'existerais pas aujourd'hui. Mais ça ne veut pas pour autant dire que le viol était quelque chose de moralement acceptable. Donc, c'est pas parce que le fruit de notre existence était moralement inacceptable, comme le viol, par exemple, que mon existence aujourd'hui n'a pas de valeur. Et donc, voilà ce qu'on peut répondre. C'est pas parce que la fécondation in vitro est immorale et qu'il faut l'abolir qu'aujourd'hui les personnes qui en sont issues n'ont pas de valeur, de la même manière que les victimes de viol, enfin les personnes qui sont issues d'un viol ont la même valeur intrinsèque que tous les autres, même si elles ont été créées dans des circonstances inadéquates. And finally, last question I had for you would be, what would you say to Catholic infertile couples who suffer from not having children, who just got happily married, and they discover 2 years after their marriage that they're not fertile, they won't be probably able to have any children throughout their whole life, and society says, "Oh, you have an option, easy option. It's IVF. Just go
Mhm.
to for IVF." And the Catholic Church says no to that. How do you answer these couples who are suffering from not having a child when they don't have the IVF option available to them?
Yeah, that is that's where we have to be really sensitive in how we evangelize and talk to people. There's two things I want to say here. I did interview a woman who was in that exact situation, and she was talking to me because she wanted me to tell other women what she wishes someone had told her. So she wishes someone had told her that it would do damage to her marriage by that act. The idea of her husband masturbating in a closet and her having hormones to extract the eggs and their children being conceived in a petri dish. And, she said that did very serious harm to their marriage. The embryos they had in the freezer created a situation in their marriage that they couldn't talk about, and so it broke their communication. And 12 years later, she said she wishes someone had talked to her back then because it started a series of things that went wrong in her marriage. And she doesn't even think that her now 12-year-old children born by IVF, she worries that they don't even understand what a healthy marriage looks like because it broke their marriage. And now their kids haven't seen a healthy marriage with good communication. And she's in a very despairing situation now. Um, and so, what she wishes people had told her is that there are other ways to be a mother. I mean, infertility can be a gift. It can be a very bitter gift in the moment because you don't want it. Um, but and I'm older now, I'm in my 50s, and I can say, as a Catholic navigating a life of faith, so many things happen in your life that you don't want to happen. But you have to keep asking God, what do you want of me? How do I conform my will to your will? And when you do that constantly, even when there are hard decisions and bitter gifts, the greatest blessings come. And so we have to be explaining that to people that infertility can be a gift. And I want to say one more thing about my aunt and uncle, but I'll stop there.
Donc, ce que dit Stacy, c'est que l'infertilité, même si c'est une épreuve douloureuse, difficile à supporter quand on l'apprend pour soi-même, et on connaît tous des couples qui traversent cette période difficile quand ils apprennent leur infertilité, en fait, on peut transformer cette douleur, cette difficulté en cadeau, en positif, en disant, bah, on peut se rendre fertile d'une autre manière, peut-être une fertilité davantage spirituelle, et on sait par exemple qu'à travers l'adoption, c'est possible de se rendre plus fertile, enfin d'être fertile spirituellement. Et donc, that's what I'm saying, that you can also become spiritually fertile
Mhm.
through adoption, things like that, other activities. So when the church says be fertile, it's of course there's a biological aspect to it, but there's
Right.
also a spiritual aspect to it, and it's the spiritual aspect that is the most important. Christians should be fertile in their Christ-like manner of speaking to the world. And so the vocation of an infertile couple could be transformed through this spiritual aspect and especially through adoption that the church encourages. So that's what I would say to people who are
Yeah.
infertile. That's actually I know it's difficult because I'm not infertile, but for someone who's going through this, it's not easy. But I think we can encourage these couples in this way. Donc voilà, je disais que on doit encourager les couples infertiles à développer une fécondité spirituelle à travers le monde, soit par des activités caritatives, missionnaires, et aussi à adopter peut-être des enfants en Afrique ou des enfants handicapés en difficulté. Il y a plein de manières dans le royaume du Christ de transformer cette difficulté, cette infertilité biologique en grande fertilité spirituelle. So,
Yes.
yeah, do you agree with that? Do you want to add anything about this?
Yeah, I do. And I just want to say I dedicated this book to my aunt and uncle. My Aunt Dana and Uncle Kenneth. Um, they've been married for over 60 years, but they became infertile in their first year of marriage because she lost a baby and the medical procedure ruptured her uterus. And so she was definitely infertile. And and all she wanted was to be a mother. And so what they ended up doing over the 60 years of marriage is they became foster parents. Do y'all have the same thing? They became foster parents. They opened their home to foster care for over 100 children over the years. And they kept in touch with these children when they were adopted, many of them. And so now they have Christmas cards, pictures, phone calls, visits from these children that they cared for who are now grown and have children of their own. And so they have been abundantly blessed with children. And I say in the book that the Proverbs say that grandchildren are the crown of the elderly, and Uncle Kenneth and Aunt Dana have many crowns.
Hmm. So, donc là, il y a un témoignage très bouleversant dans sa propre famille qui est que un couple qui a appris son infertilité 1 an après le mariage à cause d'une rupture de l'utérus qui faisait qu'il pouvait plus du tout avoir d'enfants et ils ont décidé d'adopter et ces enfants adoptés ont eu eux-mêmes ont grandi et ont eu des enfants et donc maintenant ils ont une grande famille très élargie avec plein de petits-enfants issus de ces enfants adoptés et ils sont le couple le plus heureux du monde. Ils sont entourés d'une grande famille qui les aime et donc c'est toujours possible de, voilà, de vivre cette fécondité spirituelle à travers l'adoption et une grande famille élargie. Donc c'est un très beau témoignage. Yeah, thank you for this testimony. Anything to add? Is there anything you want to add for the end of this discussion? Um,
No, just thank you for covering issues like this on your podcast, and I appreciate the work you're doing, and I thank you very much for translating. I wish I could speak 2 languages like you do, so thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah. Thank you, Stacy. Donc, merci beaucoup à Stacy Trasancos. N'hésitez pas à acheter son livre qui s'appelle IVF is not the way. Vous pouvez le trouver sur Amazon, sur d'autres liens que je vous pourrai mettre en description. C'est important que les Français soient informés sur ces questions aussi parce que ça nous concerne directement. Et donc, thank you, Stacy, for writing this book. It's a much needed book, and I hope people in France will read it too. And so I will do my best to promote it. And yeah, thank you for this wonderful work of yours. And where can we learn more about you and your work?
I have a Substack called God and Elements. Most of my writing is about natural philosophy and chemistry, philosophy and theology. So God and Elements on my Substack, and also I'm on Facebook.
Elle nous dit qu'elle a un site qui s'appelle God and Elements et elle écrit beaucoup à propos de la philosophie, de la théologie, de la chimie. Je vous rappelle qu'elle a 3 doctorats. You have 3 PhDs, right? Chemistry, philosophy, and theology.
Yeah, PhD in chemistry, master's degrees in philosophy and theology, but I'm working on a PhD in philosophy. But
Voilà,
I'm
donc
working on
elle a presque 2 doctorats et 2 masters dans des sujets différents. Donc, nous avons affaire à une très grande intellectuelle pour la défense de la foi catholique aux États-Unis. Donc, voilà, n'hésitez pas à consulter ses travaux et je vous mettrai tous les liens en description. Thank you, Stacy, for coming on this
Thank
podcast.
you.
It was a pleasure to discuss your book with you, and maybe we can talk about other subjects in the future
Yes.
if you're interested.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, you too.